Next week we have lightning talks. So I think we have 7 or 8 slots open. So if you don't know what lightning talks are, you get 5 minutes to hold everybody's attention and hopefully say something interesting and teach us perhaps a thing or two. Shout out to these lovely folks here. They sponsor and make the stuff that you put in your face every week here happen. That's a nice thing. So, not going to faff about here too much. Do want to tell you a little bit about Aaron. He's a web and accessibility advocate at Microsoft, and he's going to hopefully teach us a thing or two today about interacting with the web with one's voice. So everybody give Aaron a round of applause.
I guess you just see here to be in frame. All right. So yeah, as Brett said, I'm a web standards and accessibility advocate at Microsoft. Prior to that, I ran Easy Designs here in Chattanooga with Kelly McCarthy, who's in the back there. And I've been working on the web for over 20 years, so I'm definitely in the graybeard category. But today I want to talk to you guys about voice, because voice is something that has me really excited about kind of the future for the web and the future for creating opportunities for people to engage with online tools. So as most of you know, I'm sure chatbots and digital assistants are really becoming all the rage right now. And most of these work from very specific hard-coded data sets. But the reality is that there are more than 4.59 billion pages of content stored online at this point. And this is content that's trapped in many cases within websites. It could be articles, it could be stories, it could be blog posts, educational materials, books, marketing messages, all on the web, but for the most part, an untapped treasure trove of content that could be useful in these digital assistant scenarios and in the non-visual context. Now there have been a few projects, search spiders are probably the most popular ones, that have been working to turn that often unstructured mess into something that's more usable, to enable our web pages to be accessed in different ways and enabling them to potentially be used by voice-based user experiences. So that's what I want to talk to you about. I want to talk about how we can release our content from the context of the screen and really empower it to go anywhere and everywhere. I want it to find its way into virtual assistants and other voice-based technologies and even voiceless chatbots without us having to code and recode into all of these proprietary formats and honestly redundant formats that each of these different assistants requires. And I have a dream of enabling our users to actually be able to actively engage with our content, to fill in forms and do other things like that, all via voice. And it is possible. It's coming. Also, don't worry that there aren't anything on the screen. I'm just trying to get you to focus on me. It's not broken. And in a lot of cases, I'm going to be talking about how we can use structural HTML and ARIA to create sensible documents that are meaningful for our users and that will enable them to be more useful in these voice-based user experiences. And it all begins with a humble element. So here we have an EM element in the context of the sentence, I'm really happy to see you. Now visibly, this is rendered as italics, right? Most of us who work in HTML are aware of that. But it also adds emphasis to the content within. Now HTML is full of these really useful semantic elements. They convey meaning, they convey nuance, they allow our documents to be more expressive. And if we ignore these elements, we can actually undermine the usability of our web pages. When we create a web page, we need to be mindful of the conversation that we're creating with our customers and in the process, or that we're creating with our customers in the process, and we need to choose elements that are appropriate to that conversation and that support that conversation. Choosing our elements with intent and care. Now, one of the best indicators for how HTML will make it into virtual assistants and their kin is a current assistive technology that we have available to us, which is screen readers. right? Most operating systems, in fact, all operating systems have them at this point, and there are quite a few open source ones that you can add in as well. And not only do screen readers enable, as their name implies, the screen to be read to a user, but they also allow users to rapidly navigate documents in very specific ways, which I'll talk about, not only in the context of screen readers, but how we can use that in the context of digital assistants and the like. And they have means of translating visual design constructs like proximity, proportion, and such into audible cues. So at least they do when documents are designed thoughtfully. So without further ado, let's jump in and look at some solid examples of how we can create more meaningful documents and empower them to be more usable in the context of headless UIs. So we'll start by looking at what are called phrasing elements. Now, if you've been on the web as long as I have, you probably remember these as being considered inline elements, but they've since been renamed to be phrasing elements because that's more appropriate to what they do. The M element that we saw, the emphasis element earlier, that was a prime example of a phrasing element. So let's look at that one again really quick. So I'm, and then really happy to see you, really being inside of an M element. The M element, as I mentioned, is emphasis. So this would be spoken something like, I'm really happy to see you. Okay, we've given that little extra emphasis to that. Now, sometimes emphasis isn't enough. When we want to indicate that content is of strong importance, we use the strong element. So please fill out the form below to contact us. All fields are required. This is something that should be strongly emphasized to the user. Now, visibly, M and strong are rendered as bold and italics, respectively. And in the early days of the web, we also had the B and I elements, which could be used interchangeably with these because they would simply be bold and italics. But the reality is that they are not interchangeable anymore. In HTML5, they've been redesignated, the B and I elements, to have specific roles that they play within the HTML document. So they become a little bit different than their doppelgangers. The I element is very similar to the emphasis element, but is a bit more generic. It's used to indicate an alternate voice or mood. It can also indicate a shift in the natural language of the document. So it's a terrible movie and it made 200 million. Go figure. Go figure is something that is slightly offset, different way it's being intoned. She is admired for her energy and joie de vivre. In this case, joie de vivre, it's an alternate language that's being used in the document, and I can actually use the lang attribute to indicate that that is French. And the digitizer that would be speaking this could actually shift to doing a French accent for that particular bit of text, which is pretty neat. The B element is now used for content that's stylistically offset from the surrounding content, but is of no greater importance. So I tend to use it in a lot of instances for people's names, product names, company names, stuff like that, that I might want to do something with from a style standpoint, or I might want to do something with in terms of how I want it spoken. So in this case, I took a sample of content from Basecamp, and in this case, I marked up Basecamp as the product name, also the company name as a B element. In a lot of instances, in all practicality, B is a lot like a shorter span now. But span, as I'll talk about in a moment, is just generic phrasing content. So another context, or another semantic element we have available to us is cite, which is used for any sort of media work. So in this case, I wrote the book Adaptive Web Design. Adaptive Web Design is the title of that work, so the citation element is the one that we want to use. It can also be used kind of in the traditional sense for the citation of a quote, the source of a quote. Although more recently it's moved into magazine names, newspaper names, book names, movie titles, album titles, that sort of stuff. And HTML has other kind of specialized phrasing constructs too, such as abbreviations and acronyms within the ABBR element. So in this case, a ramp embedded in the staircase of Robson Square in Vancouver, BC. I can use the ABBR element around BC to show the expansion, British Columbia. And you have kind of two alternatives for providing that expansion. You can use the title attribute, which is kind of the older way of doing it, or you can use ARIA label to provide what that label is. The reason that I've chosen to go with ARIA label instead of the title attribute is that titles are generally not read by screen readers now. Because they've been abused so frequently, Most screen readers will skip over them. ARIA label is much more likely to be read at this point in time. So ARIA stands for the Accessible Rich Internet Application Spec, which maps a lot of the kind of complex OS type interfaces over to the web. And I'll talk a bit more about ARIA shortly. But just kind of giving you a brief introduction to it there. If you're doing more technical writing, like I tend to do a lot of times, we have the KBD for keyboard and the code elements, which we can use to indicate fragments of code. So that way people can see, in this case, press tab to move from link to link within a document. Tab is a keyboard key. And then the KBD element is used to indicate keyboard key names. And I'm using code for that. And then finally, there's the span element, which I mentioned is just a generic phrase. It has nothing specific about it, any additional information you're trying to convey. It's kind of if you absolutely need to be able to take a bit of content and have it be set off in some way and a B isn't appropriate, span would be the way to go. Now, links are also phrasing elements, but they're a much richer interface, so I wanted to kind of call them out separately because I think there are a lot of really interesting things we can do with links to ensure that we provide a great experience for users. And we can fine-tune how they're interacting with them. So the primary way we use links, obviously, is to connect related content. Now, it's important that when we choose the words that we're using, that we choose them wisely, right? That we use something that's actually going to make sense for the user. Click here to learn more is not terribly useful, especially if you have like 10 or 15 click here to learn more links on the page, right? So a ramp embedded in the staircase of Robson Square, in this case, Robson Square links to the Wikipedia page, that provides great contextual information around where that link is pointing to without having to do anything else to it. And users of assistive technology, including digital assistants or voice assistants and such, will actually, in many cases, navigate via links. So if they're moving from link to link and your links just say click here, click here, click here, they're not getting any of that surrounding context. So that's why having things like Robson Square is much more helpful to them. It's also possible to kind of have your cake and eat it too. If you only want to visibly display, let's say, finish reading, let's say that you're doing a blog or something like that, you could use a B with a class of hidden to wrap the content that you don't want visibly displayed to somebody in the browser, but you can still have that content accessibly read to somebody who is using assistive technology of some sort. So in this case, you can finish reading. The web should just work for everyone in less than 10 minutes. That's what gets read out to somebody who's using a screen reader, but visibly, all I see is finish reading as the link title. So there are some neat ways that you can kind of have it both ways. You can also use anchors, obviously, to get to a specific point in a document. This is the old school way of, or the really, really old school way of using anchors, was to actually anchor to an element within the page. So in this case, hash figure 3-3 goes down to the figure element with that ID. You can also point to specific locations in other documents. This is why I really like having ID elements, especially on referenceable content like figures. Figures, heading levels, all of those sorts of things are really useful to have IDs on. I know within kind of people who follow the trends within CSS and stuff like that, there's been a big move for people to avoid using IDs because ID selectors are so heavy-handed when it comes to specificity of CSS selectors. But IDs are still really useful in a lot of other contexts, so there's no reason you shouldn't use them. You don't have to use them as CSS selectors. You can still have an ID in the document in order to allow somebody to reference that piece of the content. That allows them to move around a lot easier. You can also go a step further and identify links that are pointing to the permanent home of a particular piece of referenceable content. So in this case, rel equals bookmark. So this is from a teaser for a blog post pointing to the read more page, right? The full version of that blog post. So if I do rel bookmark, then a assistive technology or a search engine spider can know that that link that it's pointing to is actually the canonical version of that particular thing. You can also use it to inform users of a language shift if that page that you're pointing to is not in the same language of the page that you're currently on. You can use hreflang to indicate that to them, which is kind of cool. And you can even indicate the type of content you're pointing to. So if you're pointing to a specific file, like an MP4 file or a PDF, you can indicate that on the link itself, which provides that additional information, especially to people who are non-visual, right? But could also be useful as a CSS selector to indicate to somebody that that link is going to a PDF or that link is going to a movie. You can even take it a step further if you want to prompt the user to only download that file as opposed to browse to it. If you add the download attribute onto that link, any browser that supports the download attribute will automatically download that file as opposed to taking them to that page, which may be preferable. So HTML can do some really cool stuff. It's also worth noting that we have a bunch of pseudo protocols like mail-to and tell. Those are the ones you're probably most familiar with. There's also SMS and webcal. And some operating systems and browsers allow you to register your own pseudo protocols if you have an app installed on that particular system. But it's worth noting that if you're going to go down the path of using pseudo protocols, especially custom pseudo protocols, be aware that your users, if they don't have your app installed, will probably be prompted by the OS to download an app that can actually use that pseudo protocol. So it may be kind of a jarring experience if they could potentially access that content on the web. And it could get really weird in a purely voice space where they may not be able to install your app. So all this phrasing content's great, but we spent a while kind of in the weeds, in the minutia. So I want to pull back a little bit and talk about the overall organization of our documents. So as you're no doubt aware, headless UIs place a greater cognitive load on our users, right? It's harder to keep track of where you are in an interface when you can't see it, when you're just listening to what's going on in that page. And it can be a challenge to move around without any sort of visual cues. And the more complex an interface is, the more challenging this becomes, right? This is why the whole mobile-first movement really started to generate steam, because it told us that we should focus on whatever the core purpose of a given page is and then build up the experience from that. More signal, less noise, right? But the reality is, as we've had larger and larger screens, we've started filling those with lots and lots of crap, right? So here's an older version of Forbes.com where the content is maybe 10% of the overall page. Imagine trying to parse this content without being able to see it, right? Imagine trying to tab through this document with no visual indication of where you are. So to combat this, screen readers provide a bunch of mechanisms to enable users to move throughout the document more quickly. So I'm going to walk through a couple of those just so that you're aware of them. One of them is heading levels. So browsing by heading is really important. Heading levels create a natural document outline, and that can be used by assistive technologies to help users skim through the document. They can have those headings read to them one after the other to figure out where it is that they need to be, what it is that they're looking for, and then they can tuck into that particular section. For this reason, it's best to avoid having cutesy marketing phrases in here and stick to actual usable content that could benefit somebody that is not seeing the page and that's browsing in that way. Another mechanism available for skimming interfaces involves moving the focus caret, as I talked about, using anchor links. So moving from focusable element to focusable element. That includes anchors, it includes inputs and buttons within the document as well. And traditionally that's done via the tab key on a keyboard, but in the context of a headless UI with no keyboard interface, somebody might do that via next and previous to move through that document. So this means moving from link to link. So here we have a link to John Harsanyi, and here we have a link of Veil of Ignorance. So this would help a user to know where those links are actually pointing to, and maybe if they're looking for information about John Harsanyi's experiments, thought experiments, this would help them to find what it is that they're looking for. And as I mentioned, form elements also focusable. You can also make any other element within the document focusable by doing tab index of 0. And what that does is it places this element within the tab order in the order in which it appears in the HTML. So if this came after a link, if there was a link in the paragraph above it, this paragraph would be the next thing that would be focused, and this content would be read out. And then the final way that users can actually traverse documents very easily is via what are called landmarks. Now, the concept of landmarks surfaced with the Accessible Rich Internet Application Spec, or ARIA. And the idea was to use a specific role to indicate regions of the page that are commonly used by folks. So here we have the navigation for a document, and we have a div with an ID of nav, which is great from a CSS standpoint. I know I'm targeting the navigation, but role of navigation is actually indicative of this being navigation for somebody who's using assistive technology. So it makes that function specific. They could also use a nav element, which automatically maps over to a role of navigation. But that at least places this in context. So a user could say, I want to jump to the navigation of this page, or take me to the navigation. They can automatically be brought there. There are a bunch of different roles that are for landmark purposes, such as banner, which is for the header of the document, navigation, search, main, which is for the primary content. There's also a main element now, complementary, and content info. So 24 Ways is a very dynamic content site. If you haven't checked it out, it's kind of like an advent calendar for front-end devs. And it's got a lot of rich interactions going on, and they actually use landmarks throughout the document to enable you to move more quickly through the page. So if we jump in, they've got a role of banner on their header. So that indicates that that is the header for the overall site. Then we have the role of main, which is actually redundant in this instance. The main element came after the role of main, so if the browser supports the main element, it would automatically pick up that role. But for the purposes of if a browser doesn't understand the main element, this would help it expose that as the primary content. So hopefully over time that role will go, or that, the role won't be as necessary as screen readers and browsers continue to move forward. Nav element with a role of navigation. Again, a little bit of redundancy. Footer, content info. Content info is used for information about the overall page. So a lot of times that's copyright information and such. All right, so I'm gonna do a little bit of audio here so that you can actually hear how a user would experience this.
Main landmark 2015, heading level 1. Navigation landmark browse 24 ways, heading level 1. Search landmark search 24 ways. Content info landmark copyright 2005-2016, 24 ways, and our authors, Gustafson.
So the user was actually able to go through and cycle through the different landmarks on the page in order to determine which one they wanted to move into. So that was me just cycling through one after the other, but you could move directly into any one of those landmarks. So this is a really, really low barrier to entry for creating a much more traversable document in a non-cited context. So I highly recommend checking it out. So these landmarks give users the opportunity to jump directly to specific portions of the page. And they also create opportunities for really creating interesting, engaging interfaces purely via voice, such as read me the navigation for this page. That wouldn't be possible if it didn't know that that was the navigation list for the document, right? We could start having these natural language commands for a website. Another example would be search for wooden baby toys. Because there is a role of search, the browser can know to take that user to that search form, put in wooden baby toys, and then execute the form. So we start enabling these richer interactions by adding these simple changes to the HTML document. Now it's worth noting, as I said, that many of these landmarks have equivalent HTML tags. Banner is automatically going to be assigned to the first header element that is not inside of a sectioning element. Sectioning elements are section, article, aside, and the like. Navigation has automatic or implicit role of nav. Search does not have an equivalent. Main has main. Complementary is aside. So if you use the aside element, you automatically pick up complementary. And the first footer element on the page will automatically pick up that content info role. So you don't necessarily have to explicitly use all of these roles, but if you use the proper semantic HTML, you'll automatically get those benefits. One last bit I want to touch on before moving into the next section is to discuss the div element. We often see the div employed in web pages when a designer wants to group some elements together. And that can be really useful, but it's a meaningless element. It doesn't add anything to the document in terms of context. It provides no semantic value at all. By contrast, there are a ton of organizational elements that do provide value. Paragraphs, list types, definition lists, which tend to be less often used on the web but have a lot of good use cases. Figure and fig caption. There are a ton of these, articles, section, header, footer, main, that actually provide value and can be used in place of a div as appropriate, right? And when we use these semantic elements, again, we create opportunities for more engaging natural language experiences for users. So somebody could actually say, read me all of the headlines from the front page of the New York Times, right? The browser could then open up the New York Times homepage and collect all of the article elements and collect all of the headings that are within those article elements and read those back to the user. Just from semantics. That's pretty awesome. No specialized data feed, nothing else to do, it just works. We create lots of opportunities for this stuff. HTML has a ton to offer, and I feel like a lot of times it gets overlooked. People don't really think much about the elements that they use on a page. They just go for whatever they want to. In most cases, that ends up being tons of divs when they're not necessary. But beyond organization, beyond phrasing elements and stuff like that, HTML actually has a lot it can do to streamline interactivity as well. So I want to tuck into forms and talk a bit about them. And this will kind of take us through the end of the talk. Forms, as I'm sure all of you would probably agree, are a bit of a necessary evil. We need them, obviously, to gather information from our users, information that they're willingly giving us, as opposed to the information that we're unwittingly taking from them. And HTML actually has a lot of great stuff to offer us in terms of forms. So I want to kind of tuck into that a bit and talk about how we can write our forms better in order to expedite the process of filling them out, which we all know is really arduous. So let's start with something, I want to start with something simple, but before I get into that, I want to kind of take you on a little bit of a story here. I want to talk about form labels, because this is something that doesn't often get discussed, but it actually matters a lot. So this is something that Facebook actually learned the hard way a number of years ago. So during the 2011 holidays, Facebook users were uploading photos like crazy. In the span of a few days, Facebook processed more photos than are in the entirety of Flickr. So Flickr is pretty massive, so that's a ton of photos. And that's just in a couple of days, right? And one unintended consequence of this was a significant uptick in the number of photos that were being reported to them for removal, right? So they received millions of what they refer to as photo reports for these photos that were getting uploaded to the site. But they made no sense. Moms holding babies reported for harassment, pictures of puppies reported for hate speech, and so on. 97% of these photo reports were dramatically miscategorized, right? Why was that? Facebook's engineers wanted to know, so they reached out to some of the people who had reported these in strange ways in order to find out why. Why did you report this puppy photo as hate speech? So at the time, Facebook's photo reporting form provided a list of reasons that a user could choose from if they wanted the photo removed. But what they discovered was that it didn't provide the right options or enough options for why people wouldn't want a photo posted. In some cases, maybe they didn't like the photo of themselves. Somebody had taken of them at a party in a weird pose or something like that. Or maybe the photo was of an ex-partner, or maybe it was of a beloved pet that they shared with an ex-partner that they don't get to see anymore, and they were really pissed off, and so they wanted that photo off of Facebook. There are lots of really human reasons we want people to take photos off of Facebook. And the photo reporting tool hadn't done a good job of accounting for these more personal reasons. So the Facebook engineers went to work. And they added this question: how does this photo make you feel? Actually, can we drop the lights a little bit? I just realized this is really, really faint. If it's possible to kick them off, it'll make it a little bit easier to see here. Somewhere. There we go. Is that a little bit better? Yeah? Okay. So how does this photo make you feel? Embarrassing, upsetting, saddening, bad photo, other. And that other field, really handily, had a nice little bit that you could fill in. Free response. So with this system in place, Facebook found that 50% of the people who were reporting a photo chose one of the options provided. But there was still a problem. 34% of the other respondents were writing, "It's embarrassing," rather than choosing the embarrassing option already provided. So what the Facebook team realized was that people weren't identifying with the embarrassing text, or maybe they even thought it was referring to them, that they were embarrassing, right? So the implied "it's" wasn't working. So a subtle shift in language was needed. And they changed the label to "please describe the photo. It's embarrassing, it's a bad photo of me, it makes me sad." Now with this very, very subtle change and no free response option at all, they were actually able to increase the percentage of photo reporters who chose one of the options to 78%, which was pretty huge. So I think it's important that we choose our words wisely. Even in something as simple and banal as a form, the words we choose matter. We need to talk to our users like they talk to one another. And obviously, they have a big effect on what our users do or what they fail to do in our interfaces. All right, so in Amazon's Alexa Skills Kit, they recommend that we make it clear to our users that they need to respond. And this becomes, it's important in a visual context, but it becomes even more important in a headless UI context. If your Echo just says to you, "first name," Alexa's being kind of a jerk, right? We should make it a much more conversational and clear request. Oop, I'll do that again.
What's your first name?
Right? It's a very easy change, but now we've made it very clear that we're asking for that, and it works both in a visual and a non-visual context. Similarly, it's important that we write error messages that are more conversational and clear about what it is that we're asking for and why we're asking for it.
Without your first name, I won't know how to address you. Could you please provide it?
So there's a nice, simple, clear indication of why somebody should be filling out this particular field, instead of just saying error. And then finally, if we are thoughtful about how we enter our button text, it can really help drive home what a user is doing when they're submitting a form. Submit! Submit, right? That's what so many forms say. Who wants to submit to you? Maybe somebody does, I don't know.
Reserve your spot button.
So we can reinforce what somebody's doing by telling them, hey, by clicking this button, you're reserving your spot at this event, right? Or you're sending an email to me, or you're signing up for this particular product, right? We can reinforce what it is a user is doing and kind of continue that conversation in a very human way. Now, I've already mentioned the importance of label text a bunch of times, obviously. So let's take a look at how to properly do it. Here we have one of the simplest form fields ever. What's your first name? With an input, the name of first name. Now, you could make this visually look just like a normal form, with this appearing to be the label in green, and then the input below it. But there is no association of that question to that field, if this is what you do. For that, we need the label element. But the label element in and of itself doesn't establish that connection. We actually have to either implicitly or explicitly associate the text with the field. So we can do that with the for attribute, which is an ID reference. So in this case, for equals first underscore name matches up to the ID of first underscore name. Now those two things are associated explicitly. Implicit association is done by wrapping the label around the label text and the field itself. So that's implicit labeling. Either one is possible. You can even combine them if that's your bag. But generally, the the first form is the simplest way and most explicit way to do it. Now, once you've got a good label, it's time to take a look at the field type that you're using. There are a bunch of options. There didn't used to be, but now, there are now in HTML5 a bunch of options available for us to request specific types of content from our users. And it's important that we choose the right one for the job. So here we have the classic free response, type equals text, which is also the default type, so you could leave type equals text off and it'll just be a text box. And then we have the email field, which is actually requesting an email from the user. So in the case of a virtual keyboard context, they may be shown the @ symbol, the dot, the space, because you can actually enter multiple emails in an email input field. A lot of people don't know that. Space separated. And then it just appears as a text field. But one of the cool things is you actually get, in browsers that support it, you get validation for free. So you don't actually have to include JavaScript to do that validation. And the cool thing is that if a browser doesn't understand the input of type equals email, it just reverts to being a text field. Anyone who has fat fingers like I do and types things like input type equals RDIO and wondered why their radio button looked like a text field, it's because text is the default input type. So any browser that doesn't understand type equals email will default to that field being a text input, which is what we had before HTML5 anyway. So it just works. This is a classic example of progressive enhancement, which is something probably most of you that are familiar with me talking a lot about. I've got a book about it, so a little shameless plug. You can read the first edition for free online. The second one, if you want to grab it for 35% off, that code should still work. But let's move on here. So HTML5 gave us a specific type for emails. It also gave us one for URLs, which is super handy. So type equals URL still looks like a text field. There's potentially going to be some native validation, and in virtual keyboard contexts, users are going to actually be presented with the keys to quickly enter a URL, so /, colons, and the like, including in some cases .com and stuff like that in shortcode keys, which is pretty cool. Free response is useful, but sometimes we need to have a little bit more structure to the sort of content that we're getting back from users. So to go back to the Facebook example of radio controls, here we have the label, and in this case I'm using implicit labeling of the label text and the input. Each of the radio controls has the same name and different values, and that is how it gets sent over. Alternately, you could do a select dropdown. This is a one-for-one transcription, I guess, of that from being radios to being a select dropdown. The downside of selects is they're a bit more difficult to interact with for users. A lot more clicks involved to get to the answer that they want, and they can't see all of the potential responses at once. So generally, radios and checkboxes are a bit better. Checkbox is definitely better than multiple selects, which have a lot of problems everywhere. We also have the ability to request numbers. The number field is pretty cool. We have a straight number field. We have also a type of range, which is a native slider. In this case, it's a slider ranging from 0 to 11, stepping by 1. Any Spinal Tap fans in the audience? Couple. So you might get a slider visually, but it at least traps somebody to only being allowed to enter a number between 0 and 11 in whole numbers, which is pretty cool. You can use that same min-max on a number field as well, which is pretty neat. There are a ton of other fields that I can talk about, but I've got a bunch of other stuff that I want to kind of tuck into, and we've only got about 20 minutes left. So I want to talk a bit about how we tend to overcomplicate things, especially on the front end. So UX is really ultimately all about reducing the friction of accomplishing tasks, right? Improving that user experience. And so we should be looking with our UX hats on at how can we make forms simpler for users. And a lot of times we've thought that we've been making things simpler for users by providing kind of structured fields like this for phone number. So this is a field that's asking specifically for a US phone number, right? Because this format doesn't work internationally. And instead of allowing a user to continuously type their phone number into a single field, we're requiring them to move from one field to another to input it. Sure, we could put some JavaScript in there to do it, but I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, some of the problems there. But the reason that we're doing this ultimately is because we want to make sure that we only get 3 sets of numbers, because we want to make sure the content is nicely sanitized when we put it in the database, right? We want it to be structured. We don't want to have some people with dots between their numbers, some people with hyphens between their numbers, some people with spaces between their numbers, right? Because everybody has a different way that they like to format their phone number. And we can enforce some structure here in order to make sure that the database looks nice. Well, you're basically taking a problem of sanitizing data that you could very easily do on the back end to kind of homogenize that, and you're forcing a user to have to deal with that problem rather than dealing with it yourself. You're passing the buck, right? You're placing an undue burden on your users. Now, as I mentioned, you could use JavaScript to auto-advance a user as they move from field to field. So as they hit that 3rd key, you move them to the 2nd field and so on and so forth. But have any of you ever misentered your number and tried to go back and edit with that JavaScript forwarding code in place? Yeah, it's awful. It is absolutely awful. It's such a horrible experience. And that's frustrating. And that is not good UX. So we should be striving not to do stuff like that. And furthermore, when it comes to using a field like this, or fields like this via voice, you're asking a user to supply 3 separate values, first of all, which is going to take them more time to do. And then each one of those fields requires a label. So most of you in this room would probably know that the first one is area code. You guys know the other 2? Because I bet your users are going to be really confused when you ask for their central office code and their line number. It's just not going to work. So luckily, HTML5 actually has a telephone field, the input type tel. Now, it does not do any validation against a phone number. It doesn't do any homogenization of phone numbers that come through. All of that should be done on the back end. And the reason that it doesn't do any validation is because it's got to be international compatible, right? And every country has a different number of numbers in it, in its phone numbers. So using this, yeah, we don't get that structured stuff coming from the front end, but honestly, we should be doing that structuring of the data on the back end anyway, so what does it matter? Let's go ahead and just give the user one field that they can just put in their phone number in whatever format that they want to. They could use a password manager or something like that also to automatically populate that content, which sometimes does not work all that well if you've got 3 fields. Some weird feedback on the audio here. So yeah, ultimately, we should be working harder so our users don't have to, right? It's inconsequential for us to write code to sanitize phone numbers, sanitize email addresses, URLs, all of that stuff, social security numbers on the back end. And honestly, we should be writing that code anyway because you can't trust the client, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. We can't be guaranteed that the browser is going to do the validation for us. We can't be guaranteed that JavaScript is going to run and do that validation for us. So we always need to have that final check on the back end. And we should take every opportunity to work harder so our users don't have to. Dates are another classic example of this, and there are a ton of date input types that allow users to interact with a consistent date picker in every site that uses the field. So in some cases, like Chrome actually has like kind of the traditional date picker grid. In iOS, it's multiple scrolls, multiple selects basically, and in Edge, it's multiple scrolls as well, which is kind of interesting. And yeah, it may not look consistent from browser to browser in your site, but I think consistency for a user from site to site in their browser is ultimately more important. And we can still do all the sanitization that we need on the back end to make sure that a date is actually coerced. Almost every language that I know of on the back end can coerce a string date into a date object. So it's not very difficult to do. So we should be doing that stuff. All right. We can also be very careful and help users actually avoid and fix errors by choosing how we do our markup. So the first thing that we can do to enable users to avoid problems altogether is to actually enable autofill to be smarter. So a lot of browsers will pay attention to things like field names and stuff like that to do auto-population. But we can actually provide a much more specific way of telling browsers what information to put in. So as I mentioned, a lot of them key off of the ID or the name. You can turn off auto-completion, which you should for sensitive fields like social security number and stuff like that, because a lot of browsers store that in plain text in the browser. So just FYI. But there are a ton of autofill tokens, and don't worry about kind of going through this list. I'm going to show you a couple of examples. But these indicate to the user within that autocomplete field the type of content that you're asking for. So, and then there's some modifiers as well. So here we have ship the blue gift to somebody. And in the input for the address field, we've got section blue, so you can indicate that something is sectioned. Shipping is the address type that we're looking for, and we're looking for the street address. And then in the second field, the section's still blue, shipping address level 2, and then shipping postal code. So I'm looking for a shipping address. The browser knows it's got a shipping address. It can allow the user to auto-populate the street, level 2, which is the city, and then the postal code, which is really cool. And in a headless UI context, the assistant could actually just ask them what shipping address they want to use and then auto-populate those fields. The user never even has to touch those fields with their focus caret, which is kind of cool. You just streamlined that checkout process so much more easily. If you're curious, the order is you can have any sort of optional section in there if you want, shipping, billing, modifiers for different phone types, and then whatever the autofill token name is. And the longest one you could potentially run into would be something like this. So the label is there a mobile number where we can reach you on regarding delivery? So in this case, the section is read, shipping mobile telephone, right? So the autofill token that I'm looking for maps directly to that label, which is kind of cool too. So if somebody does get asked that question. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, this sort of affordance can do a ton to reduce the friction of people filling out forms, especially in a voice context. If you're interested, Jason Grigsby wrote up a great post that talks about all of this autofill stuff, as well as like credit card scanning and stuff like that that's available in browsers today, and it's up on the Cloud4 blog. So I highly recommend checking that out if you're interested. So the next step, once we've got those autofill tokens in there, is to let users know when a field is required. So we can do that in a myriad of ways. We can indicate fields marked with an asterisk are required. This is kind of the old school way of doing it. And then we have a B with an asterisk inside of it. Well, that doesn't really give that sort of information in the same way as we would hope that it would in a non-visual context. We could do something like put some text up above, all of the fields are required, if we happen to have only required fields, which I highly recommend. But again, that doesn't programmatically tell somebody when they move the focus caret only to those fields that that particular field is required, because this is not in the tab order of the document, so it can't receive focus. But we can use the required and ARIA required equals true attributes. Now, there's a little redundancy there, but assistive tech pays more attention to the ARIA required attribute than they do the HTML5 required attribute. Hopefully that'll change over time, but for right now, the redundancy is good. And then once we've got that, we can provide useful hints to users as to the types of content that we're looking for, so that we save them from running into errors. So we can use things like if we're asking for a particular pattern. So in this case, I'm asking for a Delta flight number. What flight are you looking for? The pattern is going to be DL and then any digits between 2 and infinity. So in this case, the placeholder, I'm giving an example, DL5407. So because I'm asking for a specifically formatted number or formatted text string, I'm going to indicate what that flight number should be, how it should be formatted. And then the placeholder would be visibly displayed to the user, or it could be spoken to them by the assistive tech. We want to do validation in the browser. As I mentioned, required HTML5 browsers, required will automatically block the browser from submitting any required fields that are not filled out. It'll do email validation if somebody has an email field and the browser supports it, so that's all good. It'll also do, if you use the pattern attribute, it will see if the text that's entered actually matches that regular expression, which is pretty cool. And the sort of error that you'll get back is please match the requested format, which you can see here. Browsers that don't implement the HTML5 algorithm, which I think the last holdout is Safari at this point. At least last time I checked, they still had not implemented it, although I think they were in the process. But every other browser will block and usually focus the user to the first field that has an error, which is pretty cool. If somebody does not have HTML5, you can fall back to a JavaScript-based validation, and you can use all of these same methods, all of these same attributes that you've put in your HTML to be keys for that JavaScript. So the JavaScript itself, the validation library, can be really small. We wrote one that was like fully expanded and commented in JavaScript was like 120 lines of code, and it validates pretty much every form type. So it doesn't take much code to do that. And you can basically just have the HTML providing all the context that you need. When you do supply an error, though, you want to make sure that you're providing that error in an accessible way. You can use ARIA described by to provide that context. So it's an ID reference, very much like the for attribute. So ARIA described by equals email error. That points to the strong element, which has your email address as required as the validation error. Okay. All right.
Your email star edit required invalid entry. Your email address is required blank.
That's what it sounds like in the context of a screen reader right now. So we can actually provide, after the label is read, whatever that description is, whatever that error is. All right, last little section, validating on the server. This is super important. I'll tell you a little story. So back in 2001, when the original Xbox came out, we as an industry put a lot of faith in the browser, and we didn't really think about how sites could be hacked all that much. Right? This was the time before dev tools, right? We didn't have any in-browser dev tools for being able to manipulate the document. And so the developer of one particular site had coded up the form to purchase the Xbox with a hidden input with the value, with the price of that particular item in the HTML. Now, because we couldn't go in and manipulate that in real time, it was relatively safe. But you know what? Browsers always have that save option. So some enterprising person, probably a young man, went through and decided to save the document, changed it in a local text editor, opened it up in their browser, and of course the form submitted with a value of 1 to the server. And yeah, they got an Xbox for $1 because there was no back-end validation to check that the price that was sent over the wire was the actual price of the item itself. Right? Now, none of us, I would hope, would be stupid enough to do this nowadays, because with dev tools, it's incredibly easy to adjust markup. In fact, how many people here have fixed a broken page in dev tools in order to do something? Yeah. It's kind of sad that we have to do that, right? So DevTools have made it so much easier for us to go in and manipulate documents that you should be doing validation on the server, because we know we can never trust the client, right? We can't trust that HTML5 validation is going to take place. We can't trust that our JavaScript validation is going to take place. We can't trust really anything. We can only trust the server that we control. So when content comes over the wire, we need to go ahead and validate it. We need to do any sort of massaging that's necessary in order to make that content fit the structure that we want in our database, and so on and so forth. The server side is our last line of defense against people doing stuff like that. So as such, we should be doing server-side validation and spitting back errors if we find them. And so I want to just kind of go really quickly through how we would do that. We want to summarize server-side errors. So there are errors with your form submission. We could do that with an introduction and then maybe list what the errors are, maybe with helpful anchors to the individual fields that have problems. And since each of those has an ID to associate it with a label, we can jump users directly down to those fields to correct them, which is pretty handy. And then depending on the browser, if we add a role of alert, we can end up with something a little bit like this.
Contact retreats 4 geeks. There were errors with your form submission. 1. Message is a required field. 2. Name is a required field. 3. Email is a required field.
So that was the load of the page after the form submitted with errors in it. It did a little chime, you may have heard that, and then it read out this content, which is super handy. Again, varies based on browser implementation, but that can be really useful. And then you, of course, want to have the server rendering those same sort of inline validation errors and helping users to figure out what's wrong and how to fix it. So hopefully, this hour has showed you that HTML is a very, very robust and expressive language that's often overlooked, right? That often just kind of gets brushed under the carpet. And if we take care with how we craft our HTML, we can actually nurture conversations with our users. We can enable our content to go further, to go into those not so distant future interfaces of things like Alexa, Cortana, Siri, and enable people to do more with our sites and the products that we're building. Hopefully this rather brief overview of HTML has kind of opened your eyes to what you can do with semantic markup. Or if you were already a true believer of semantic markup, hopefully it gave you a few tips and tricks that you can apply to the work that you're doing today. So thank you all very much. We've got 50 seconds for questions. Yes? I can repeat it.
One of my pet peeves is, yes, why I have to enter my city.
That's not a question, it's a statement, but he's upset because he has to enter city, state, and zip code separately. Yeah, I mean, what you could do in a field, and I've done this as well, is you could allow somebody to enter their postal code, and if JavaScript's available, you could do queries against that, determine, A, does this postal code exist in multiple countries? If it doesn't exist in multiple countries, you can automatically fill that in. If it does, you can allow them to pick their country, and then you're done. So yeah, there are a lot of affordances that you can create with JavaScript to ease the completion of forms, for sure. Is there an actual question? Oh, link to the book? If you go to adaptivewebdesign.info, that'll take you there. Yeah. And I think the code was adaptive from Pearson. We'll give you the, if you go to the, or rather Peach Pit. If you go to the Peach Pit site and use the code adaptive as when you're checking out, it'll give you 35% off. Other questions? Yeah. So the question is, could you theoretically use pattern on a telephone field? Yes, if you know that you are specifically only asking for people within the US, or you already know their country and stuff like that, you could apply validation specific to that country. So in the case of bellhops or something like that, if you know where the person's address is that you're picking them up from, you could apply US validation if you spread internationally eventually. That could be done based on the country that the user's residing in. So yeah, you could absolutely do that. Other questions? All right, well, thank you all very much.